Ancient Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia didn't just invent cities, writing, and taxation. They also invented one of the first systems for extracting max labor from ordinary people on a massive scale. And like many governments throughout history, they justified it as a necessary for the survival of civilization itself. Around 3000 BCE, the Sumerian city-states depended on enormous public works projects. Irrigation canals had to be dug, city walls had to be maintained, and temples required constant expansion. None of this happened for free. Every able bodied citizen owed labor to the state through a system known as corva labor, essentially a labor tax paid with your time instead of your money. For weeks or even months at a time, farmers would be pulled away from their fields and ordered to work on projects. Clay tablets from cities like Ur and Lagash record thousands of workers being assigned to dig foundations, transport bricks, and maintain infrastructure under the supervision of state officials. Refusing wasn't really an option. That same government controlled the food supply, legal system, and military, which monitored access to the land many families depended on for survival. The Babylonians expanded these systems even further. Under Hammurabi's rule, the state carefully documented labor obligations, wages, and penalties. On paper, workers were compensated. In practice, many laborers received little more than grain rations, barely sufficient to support their families. The burden fell especially hard during poor harvest years when citizens were already struggling. As if this wasn't enough, debt added another layer of exploitation. Families unable to repay loans could be forced into labor arrangements that lasted years. Some even surrendered children or relatives into temporary servitude to satisfy creditors. Imagine your dad selling you into slavery because he gambled away your college tuition. Yeah. While technically legal and regulated, the reality was worse. If crops failed, ordinary people often found themselves working for powerful institutions just to avoid starvation. Mesopotamia's rulers didn't think they were oppressing their people necessarily. They just thought this was the price for civilization. The canals that fed the cities, the walls that protected them, and the temples that represented their power were all built by those who rarely had a choice in the matter. Long before governments collected taxes, they collected something far more valuable: your time and labor. Ancient Greece. The Greeks gave the Western world philosophy, democracy, and some of the earliest ideas about citizenship. But behind the marble temples and wine-fueled debates was a vulnerable society that depended heavily on a military they were essentially handed for free in two different ways. Unlike the centralized states of Mesopotamia and Egypt, Greek city-states relied on a mixture of taxation and outright slavery on top of compulsory public service to keep society functioning. The differentiating factor is they took it a step further with forced inscription. Athens, ironically celebrated as the birthplace of democracy, required citizens to contribute military service whenever the state demanded it. During the times of war, farmers could spend months away from their land serving as hoplites or rowers in the city's massive naval fleet. For wealthier citizens, public obligations often came in the form of financial contributions, known as liturgies. Sorry if I pronounced that wrong. Basically funding the whole effort. For everyone else, it was, again, their time, general well-being, and labor that paid the bill. But to be frank, the real foundation of the Greek economy was slavery. By some estimates, slaves made up a third of the population in major city-states. Now, you might say,
well, slavery isn't exploitation since they're slaves, not workers, right?
Well, there was one notable exception to Greece's harsh labor systems. In 594 BCE, the Athenian lawmaker Solon abolished debt slavery for Athenian citizens, preventing people from being sold into bondage simply because they couldn't repay a loan. It was a revolutionary reform for its time. The catch was that it only protected citizens, not immigrants. The vast population of enslaved workers who powered the Greek economy saw no such relief, thus being exploited. Nowhere was this exploitation more visible than the silver mines of Laurium outside Athens. Thousands spent their lives underground in narrow tunnels, extracting the silver that funded Athens' navy, public works projects, and imperial ambitions. Conditions were so brutal that ancient writers rarely bothered discussing them at all, treating the suffering as an ordinary part of economic life. Sparta took a different approach. Rather than importing large numbers of slaves, the Spartans built their entire society around the exploitation of the helots, a conquered population forced to farm the land and surrender much of their harvest. The helots vastly outnumbered Spartan citizens, creating a constant fear of rebellion. To maintain control, Spartan authorities subjected them to violent intimidation, propaganda, and psychological warfare. The state itself became an instrument for keeping a labor force permanently oppressed. This directly parallels to modern life. Many people stay stuck in jobs they hate because, unbeknownst to them, they're mentally drained from the media, news, and food they consume outside of work. It's like the Hulk versus a bunch of minions. Sure, they outnumber him, but they'll never win. Long before governments learned to tax income, they unlocked a cheat code. Just control the land, laws, and the military, and you can usually control the workforce too. Ancient India. India's exploitation of workers didn't come in the traditional sense. It came via the deletion of opportunity. Enter the caste and jati system, which strictly divided society into hierarchical groups. At the bottom, lower castes, also known as untouchables, were legally coerced into performing the most dangerous, degrading, and vital tasks. If that doesn't sound bad enough, the program was hereditary, meaning occupations often passed down generation from generation. In many cases, the work you performed was determined before you were even born. So if your parents were poor, you'd be poor too. At the bottom of this hierarchy were communities assigned the most dangerous, unpleasant, and socially stigmatized jobs in society. Tasks such as waste removal, handling animal carcasses, leatherworking, and other forms of manual labor were frequently concentrated among groups that later became known as relieds, historically labeled untouchables by higher castes. What made this system particularly powerful wasn't just the work itself, it was the lack of potential. And what I mean by that is those born into the lowest occupations were expected to remain there for life. The system effectively created a stable labor force that could perform essential work generation after generation, without the state needing to constantly recruit or coerce new workers. The hidden upside of the caste was that you could effectively separate and lock away a portion of the population for this slave labor. Unlike today, you didn't have thousands of young people competing for top positions in society, which many of are focused on trivial skills in the government's eyes, like pro sports or music, thus reducing the amount of people willing to do normal jobs, which is usually a problem. So you could see why the Indian governments liked this. Ancient governments benefited enormously from this arrangement. Roads were maintained, fields were cultivated, goods were produced, and cities functioned because every social group had an assigned role within the broader economy. The state didn't always need to force people into specific jobs. Society itself often did the enforcing. Texts such as the Arthashastra reveal just how closely rulers monitored labor, taxation, and economic production. To administrators, a predictable workforce meant stability. To ordinary workers, it often meant that opportunity was limited by circumstances they could never change. The result was one of history's most durable systems of labor control. While other civilizations rely on chains, military force, or direct government commands, ancient India often achieved the same outcome through social structure. For millions of people, the question wasn't what they wanted to do with their lives. It was whether they had any choice at all. Medieval Europe. Medieval Europe solved the problem of labor in a surprisingly simple way. Instead of forcing people into government work camps or assigning them occupations at birth, it tied millions of workers directly to the land itself. The system was known as serfdom. By the High Middle Ages, most of Europe's rural population lived under the manor system. Vast estates controlled by nobles, bishops, or kings functioned as self-contained economic worlds. At the center stood the Lord Manor's house. Surrounding it were fields worked by peasants whose lives were governed by obligations they had little ability to escape. Most of these peasants were serfs. Legally, they weren't slaves. They couldn't usually be bought and sold as individuals, but they also weren't free. A serf was bound to the lord's land and generally could not leave, marry, relocate, or change occupations without permission. In exchange for a small plot of land to support their family, they owed labor to the lord. Several days each week might be spent working the lord's personal fields, known as the demesne, completely unpaid. The arrangement was remarkably productive for the ruling class. The lord received a guaranteed workforce, share of the harvest, and various fees collected through a serf's life. Peasants paid to use the lord's mill, paid to bake in the lord's oven, and in some regions, even paid fees when inheriting land or receiving permission to marry. Sort of like how we get taxed on our income, and then we have to pay more tax when spending that income. Sounding familiar? What made the system particularly effective was that it was difficult to escape. A farmer born into serfdom usually remained a farmer. His children would likely be farmers as well, not kings. The land that sustained the family also acted as a cage, making social mobility almost impossible for large portions of the population. So, once people started to catch on to the ploy, they realized that they couldn't just pack up and dip. A truly interesting form of medieval monopoly. Medieval society portrayed this relationship as a system of mutual obligation. Lords provided protection, and peasants provided labor. But from the perspective of many serfs, the reality was much simpler. The harvest came from their hands, while much of the reward flowed upward. The Aztec Empire. The Aztecs exploited workers differently from most civilizations on this list. Rather than tying people to land like Europe or assigning occupation at birth like India, the Aztecs built a society where advancement depended heavily on your stats during military operations. For them, warfare wasn't simply a government activity. It was one of the primary ways ordinary men could improve their social standing. Successful warriors gained prestige, privileges, valuable goods, and opportunities unavailable to much of the population. The result was a system where military service became deeply intertwined with economic life. At the same time, ordinary communities carried the burden of supporting the empire's constant campaigns. The only reason it actually worked was because many participants viewed it as opportunity, rather than exploitation. The government wasn't simply forcing people to work, it created incentives so powerful that people willingly organized their lives around the needs of the state. From the perspective of Aztec rulers, this produced one of the most formidable military societies in the Americas. Now, switch to the worker's perspective. It meant that a significant portion of economic activity was ultimately directed toward maintaining an empire built on perpetual warfare that you probably didn't support. The Aztecs understood something modern governments would later rediscover. People don't always need to be forced to serve the state. Sometimes, the most effective system is one that convinces them that their success depends on it. The Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire discovered a form of worker extraction so unusual that historians still debate whether it should be viewed as exploitation, progress, or something in between. It was called the devshirme. Beginning in the 14th century, Ottoman officials periodically traveled through Christian communities in the Balkans and selected boys to serve the state. These children were removed from their families, converted to Islam, educated, and trained for careers within the imperial system. From the government's perspective, the arrangement was brilliant. Instead of relying entirely on hereditary nobles who might challenge the Sultan's authority, the empire created a class of administrators and soldiers whose status depended entirely on the state. Many entered the janissaries, which was the elite military corps. Others rose into the government, administration, finance, diplomacy, and even the highest offices of the empire. For the families involved, however, the experience was far more complicated. Some viewed selection as a devastating loss. Others recognized that a chosen son for imperial service could achieve opportunities impossible in their local village. The same system that separated children from their communities also created pathways to wealth, power, and influence unavailable to much of Europe's population at the time. The Ottoman state benefited enormously from this arrangement. It would gain a steady supply of highly trained manpower while weakening local power structures that might resist imperial authority. Loyalty flowed upward to the Sultan rather than outward to regional elites. Few governments have ever managed to transform the children of conquered populations into the very officials responsible for governing their own. The genius of this system was that it blurred the line between opportunity and exploitation. The Ottoman government wasn't simply extracting labor, but reshaping lives, turning human potential into a state resource, and for centuries it worked. Colonial Americas. The colonial Americas solved a fundamental problem facing every empire. How do you force people to work without technically calling them slaves? The answer was debt. Across Spanish colonies in Mexico, Peru, and much of Latin America, colonial authorities developed labor systems that appeared voluntary on paper but looked very different in practice. Indigenous communities were required to provide labor for mines, farms, workshops, and public projects under a variety of legal arrangements designed to keep the colonial economy running. Perhaps nowhere was this more obvious than in the auberges, large textile workshops that operated through the Spanish Empire. Workers were often paid so little that they accumulated debts to workshop owners faster than they could repay them. Food, housing, tools, and supplies could all be charged against a worker's account. The result was debt peonage, a system where leaving became legally impossible because the worker supposedly still owed money. In some workshops, laborers were locked inside at night. Yeah, punished for failing production quotas, and then trapped in financial obligations that could last decades. The workshop wasn't officially a prison, it simply performed many of the same functions. The British colonies developed their own version of labor control through indentured servitude. Workers agreed to labor for years in exchange for transportation across the Atlantic, but many discovered that contracts could be extended, manipulated, or enforced under brutal conditions. For thousands of poor Europeans arriving in the New World often meant exchanging one form of hardship for another. What makes the colonial era unique is that exploitation increasingly hid behind contracts, debts, and legal paperwork. Governments and colonial authorities learned that chains weren't always necessary. A signature, a debt, or a labor obligation could accomplish much the same thing. The lesson colonial governments learned was simple. If people believe that they owe you something, you can control them just as effectively as if they belong to you. If you want to learn more about dark money hacks from history, I made a whole video about that, so check it out right up here. Thanks for watching. Make sure to hit that like and subscribe, as not only would I appreciate it, but it would also help out a ton. Cheers.